America gave two great ideas to the world, beginning with our revolution and over the last 200 years. One very profound, important American contribution to world political thought was the idea that here kings don't rule, the people do. And so we decide most questions in life based on votes and based on majority rules, sometimes a larger majority, sometimes a simple majority. But the idea is that we, the people, in most instances, ought to be able to decide for ourselves the laws that govern us as we live our lives together in our precious time on earth. The second, equally important contribution that America made to world political thought was the idea that not everything gets put up for a vote, that there are certain basic rights, certain fundamental freedoms that are so important and so precious to us, each one of us, as a matter of our inalienable human rights, that they can't be taken away even by a majority, even by a popular majority against a vulnerable or unpopular minority, even a minority of one. The freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of religion, and the freedom to marry, among others. So these two bedrock principles, great American contributions, are things that every American needs to understand. And when we look at the history of our country, what we see is that sometimes the majority, sometimes the politicians, the elected officials who represent us as the majority, make mistakes. I know it may shock people to think that politicians would make mistakes, but sometimes our elected legislators, our governors, our presidents, don't get everything right. And so the genius of the American vision was to take these two great principles and create a mechanism that provided checks and balances, a system of preventing abuses against these fundamental freedoms and rights while enabling us to come together and function as a society. One of the most important checks and balances we have in our system is the Constitution itself. The idea that there are certain structures of government and there are certain basic fundamental rights that are enshrined in the law, the supreme law of the Constitution, that can't be taken away or whittled away or ignored at the lesser level of individual laws or individual political actions, even actions that are popular with a temporary majority. Another important check in the system is the idea that no player should be the judge in its own cause, that no one gets to make the final decision on whether it itself did the right thing. The president is checked and balanced by the Congress. The Congress is checked and balanced by the court. By the president, and they're both checked and balanced by the courts. When Congress passes a law, or when state legislatures pass a law, the president or governors can veto them. If the thing becomes a law, there still is a final referee, and that is the courts. And their job is to measure, the court's job is to measure what the elected officials do, what the majority may even want done, against the highest will of the people, which is the will that's put into the Constitution, that says that we don't even want ourselves to be able to override certain basic protections that each one of us cherishes. We, the majority, don't want to be able to take away, we said in the Constitution, the freedom of speech, even for somebody we don't like. We don't want a minority's religion to be subject to the dictates or will, even of the majority. And that fundamental notion of protected individual rights enforced under the Constitution by the courts is what keeps our country free. It's what keeps these two great principles that are the bedrock foundations of democracy, as we understand it, alive for all of us. When the courts fail to do their job, or when they come under pressure to ignore the Constitution, to run away from doing their duty because it's not popular, all of us lose, because we then all become vulnerable to the next wind, the next prejudice, the next passion, the next majority tyranny that might be able to override the individual rights that each one of us has in a society. Gay people have the same interest, the same need, and the same inalienable right to the protection of the Constitution and the protection by the courts, as well as by the elected officials who are supposed to also follow their oath to the Constitution. When the courts fail to strike down discrimination enacted by the majority, the courts are failing to do their job. When politicians attack judges for standing up against even the majority, the politicians are betraying the Constitution because they are pandering to prejudice at the expense of these fundamental American principles. When gay people are denied the equal protection of the law, the requirement in our Constitution, in our system, that says that the majority can't have one kind of treatment for itself that it denies to a minority, that at a minimum, the majority has to treat everyone equally, and if it's going to dish out lumps to one, it has to be willing to take those lumps itself. If that principle is not applied, that principle of equal protection, by the politicians and by the courts, we all lose. This has come into increasing importance in the civil rights struggle of gay people, just as it actually has always been of importance in every civil rights struggle. The whole attack on so-called activist judges didn't begin with gay people. It began in the civil rights era of African Americans, when, after Brown versus Board of Education, billboards were put up saying, "Impeach Earl Warren," the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who had written the decision. Many legislators in Congress signed what was called the Manifesto of Massive Resistance, saying that these judges were now tyrants who were trying to force their will on the people, when in fact the judges were enforcing the highest will of the people, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that provides equal protection and individual freedoms to all of us. The same thing is true for gay people today. When California allowed a measure to go on the ballot, Proposition 8, to take away a fundamental freedom, the right to marry, and not only to take it away, but to take it away from only one group of people, it betrayed the principle of equal protection and of constitutional rights. And if the court fails to strike that down, we still will win the freedom to marry in California, because public opinion, slowly, bit by bit, as we tell our stories, as people come to understand that there's no good reason for excluding these couples from marriage, hearts and minds open, the younger generation is moving with us, and public support is building for ending this discrimination, and we will restore the freedom to marry in California. But the idea of having to do that by vote is wrong. It's un-American. This is something that should not be put up for a vote, because in America not everything goes to a vote. Fundamental rights, whether you should have free speech, whether you should have freedom of religion, whether you should have the freedom to marry, is not something even a majority should be voting on. It's a matter of bedrock rights and principles, and the Constitution and the courts exist to defend those even when they're unpopular. When the first court in the country struck down race restrictions on who could marry whom, it took almost all of American history to get to that point. From 1776 until 1948, not a single court in the country had the courage to strike that down, to say that interracial couples should be allowed to marry. Finally, in 1948, one court went first by a vote of 4-3, and it was the California Supreme Court. And when the court made that ruling, striking down race restrictions on who could marry whom, 90% of the American people were against it. But the court did its job. It took another 19 years before this question of race restrictions on marriage came again to the United States Supreme Court, which had gotten it wrong previously. And when in 1967 the Supreme Court made its ruling, agreeing with the California Supreme Court, and struck down race restrictions on marriage nationwide, 70% of the public opposed interracial marriage. Now imagine what our country would look like today had those prejudices, that 90% opposition, that 70% opposition, those prejudices of the majority at the time, those passions of the moment over interracial marriage and racial equality, imagine if they had been enshrined in the Constitution then, what would our country look like today? Would our president even have been born? There are just some things Americans have always believed that should not be put up to a vote. And courts and constitutions exist to protect those things for all of us. And all of us includes gay people.